Day 7 of 90 focused on calculator and games. The goal today was using practice, calculator and games to keep domain rules separate from framework and storage details. I did not want a framework tour. I wanted a model I could still explain after the demo code grew into a real application. The first concrete check was domain boundaries. That sounds small, but it decides whether the code reads like a contract or like a lucky sequence of framework calls. The second check was dependencies that point the right way. That is usually where bugs start if the edge of the system is vague, because bad assumptions leak deeper into the app before anyone notices. The third check was failure paths designed as early as the happy path. Once that was visible, keep package boundaries, workflow ownership, and cross-component contracts explicit. That is what made the lesson feel reusable instead of tied to one tutorial example. The implementation only started to feel solid once separate domain workflow from transport and persistence so the system can evolve safely. In Java, that usually means the types, services, and framework wiring all need to agree about who owns each decision. I kept returning to one more rule: design the recovery and maintenance path at the same time as the happy path. That is the part that shortens debugging because the code tells you where to look instead of forcing you to reconstruct the intent from scratch. The predictable mistakes were spreading workflow rules across packages without a clear ownership model and pretending the happy path defines the system while maintenance and recovery are left vague. They look different on the surface, but both come from letting convenience win over clarity. So my recap for day 7 is simple: using practice, calculator and games to keep domain rules separate from framework and storage details. Keep domain boundaries, dependencies that point the right way, and failure paths designed as early as the happy path visible, and the code stays much easier to test, explain, and change. One reason I keep drilling these days is that production changes usually alter the surface area, not the core contract. If the contract is clear, the refactor stays local instead of infecting the whole project, and that is a much better place to be when release pressure shows up. That is especially true in Java, where Spring configuration, ORM mappings, messaging, and background work can all make the code look more connected than it should be. Clear ownership prevents the drift and gives you a much smaller search space the first time something breaks. A lot of debugging time disappears when the request path, async path, or data path is obvious from the structure. The language and framework help, but only if the design is honest and the boundary is visible in naming, types, and flow. My test is simple: could I explain this same design tomorrow with a different example and still keep the same reasoning? If yes, the lesson probably landed for real. If not, I probably memorized a recipe instead of understanding the trade-off. I also ask where the next teammate would hesitate. That question usually points at the first boundary that is still implied instead of stated, and cleaning that up early is almost always cheaper than doing it after 2 more features land on top of it. When the code is shaped well, the DTOs, handlers, services, and logs tell the same story. When they do not, the mismatch shows up in review before it shows up in production, which is exactly where I want the correction to happen. That is why I keep practicing with one concrete path at a time. A small path is enough to reveal whether I understand the design or only recognize the tooling around it, and that is a much better signal than just getting the sample app to run once. The pattern I am looking for is repeatability. If I can take the same boundary, reuse it in a slightly different context, and still trust the behavior, then I know the lesson moved from recognition into working engineering judgment.